Hello everyone. Today our lesson is on Queen Esther. We're going to do maybe a 30-minute Bible study every day on the book of Esther. Queen Esther must have really thought whoever said being the queen was easy. You know, as a child, you grow up thinking as a girl about queens and beauty contests and things such as that, and it really is fascinating to a young girl. I remember as a girl who only had brothers and mostly men in my entire family, I never got to do the beauty queen stuff and get excited about all that. But we had friends who lived in a Victorian home. There were 7 children, 6 of them were girls, and we would get to go over to their house every Sunday and play. The older girls had just closets full of gowns and dresses and high heels and makeup, and those girls let me play in their stuff. I used to have the best time acting like a princess or a queen every time we went to their home, and I remember that even to this day. It was such great fun. Well, the book of Esther is only one of 2 books in the entire Bible that are named after women. I know that you know the other one is the book of Ruth. And the book of Esther also does not mention God's name. Now, what scholars say is that God's name was too important and too sacred to write on paper. So therefore, they only alluded to God, but they would not write his name on paper. But as you'll see in this study, the Lord is all over this book. He's all over everything, and we do know that. But there are certain things that the people did in this book that showed you that they were interested in the Lord and the Lord's will for their life. Esther starts out, well, let me say this first. We don't know who wrote the book of Esther. Some believe it was Esther's cousin, Mordecai. Whoever wrote this book has all the dates, the times, the customs, and the details in perfect order. And in my opinion, this person must have been there to have known all this. The book opens up with a banquet. In chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we see that the stage is set for the rise of a queen. Now, it says, it comes to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. Now, I'm Southern. I may not pronounce the names precisely the way they're supposed to be pronounced, but that's how I speak. So we'll just deal with it. Now, it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This was Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel. Now, Shushan the citadel was a winter residence. That's all it is it's a place of the king, and the citadel was a palace complex built above the city for protection. Now, King Ahasuerus was having a party. It says that he was just in the 3rd year of his reign, and he made a feast for all of his officials, his servants, nobles, princes, everyone. He was just having this big party at his place. And in verse 4 it says, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So what he's saying, what the writer is describing to us, is that King Ahasuerus wanted to show off his beautiful palace, all his luxuries that were inside. He showed off the fact that he was the king and that everything in his kingdom was magnificent. Many days this king had this party. He invited all these people. It was 180 days, which equals 6 months. Now, can you imagine over 2,000 people at your house for 6 months? There is no way. I could not imagine it. I would not call it a banquet or a feast. I would call it torture, but that's just me. So it says, when the days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in the Shushan and the citadel. Remember, that's just a place, from great to small, in the court of the garden in the king's palace. So this verse tells us that this large feast was finally over and another small feast was given. And this feast lasted for 7 days. And it was for the smaller group. It was given for the servants and other employees in the palace, from the custodians to the soldiers. But there were many people in this group, and they had their feast in the garden. Maybe because it was easier for them to clean up, because if it was the servants and so forth, they still had to clean up and they still had to take care of the residents. So we just don't know why they feasted in the courtyard, but that's probably why. It was common to hang curtains and decorate. And in verse 6 it tells us there was white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords. I mean, you got to imagine how beautiful this was. Purple and silver rods and marble pillars. The couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black. It was just gorgeous. The couches were reclining couches, and the alabaster was a whitish color, fine grain, as used in statues or vases. They were marble streaked, and they were beautiful. So you have to imagine this party and all the beauty that surrounds it. Now, whoever wrote the book of Esther, and I do believe it was Mordecai, but I don't know, must have been in the courtyard, because they gave such detail of the beauty that they saw. Now, in verse 7 it says they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. So basically it's saying that there was all types of golden goblets, and so they're having this party and people are drinking from these golden goblets. Verse 8 it says, in accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. And what that means is it was not a law that you had to drink at the party. Believe it or not, some of the parties, it was mandatory that you drank. It was an offense if you didn't. But this particular party, it was up to you. The soldiers were informed of this law, so there'd be no misunderstanding. No one would accidentally be arrested for drinking too much or too little. So you could drink the way you wanted to drink. The reason this was stated was because some customs, again, were, if you're not going to drink, you just need to go home. They were obligated to drink. So this particular party, the drinking was up to each person. Can you imagine the amount of money the king spent on alcohol alone for this party? So the King Ahasuerus, he's only been in office 3 years. Now he has a queen, and her name is Vashti. I like to riddle things, like King Ahasuerus in my mind. When I have to remember his name, I think King Ahasuerus, and I say to myself, he has a reason, and we'll figure out that reason later. So when I hear King Ahasuerus, I know that he had a reason, and his wife's name, his queen, was Vashti. Now, I loved Vashti, but my riddle for Vashti was Vashti would not be nasty. And it says in verse 9, Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So while the men were feasting in one area, the women were feasting with the queen. And on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, in other words, when the king was drunk, he commanded the eunuchs. I won't go through all the names there, but he has these 7 eunuchs, and he commands them. They all served him. Let me tell you what a eunuch is. A eunuch is a man who has been castrated. Now, usually what that means is the kings would castrate younger men to take care of the women and to take care of other things in the palace. And once they were castrated, they were not interested in women anymore. So he had a man's strength and so forth to take care of things, but yet he knew that they would not impregnate his women. He knew that a lot of times if he allowed a man who was interested in women to do that, this man would produce more children and actually overtake the kingdom by his power of more children and more wives and so forth and so on. So a lot of the kings were very smart, and they would just use castrated men who were called eunuchs. So he had these 7 eunuchs, And on the seventh day, when he's drunk, he commands these eunuchs to bring Vashti before the king, wearing her crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. Now, King Ahasuerus wanted his queen to come down in the courtyard so that he could show off her beauty. So, the people in Shushan, all the people with the power and authority, along with the workers and servants, all these people are at this party. And he wants his queen to come down wearing her royal crown. Now, you have to imagine what Vashti must have looked like. She was beautiful, according to Scripture. She actually had 3 children with King Ahasuerus, or 3 sons that I have studied about and know about. And she was probably, if we had to describe her in our own mind, because I want you to be at this feast. I want you to see everybody drinking. I want you to smell the alcohol. I want you to see the goblets. I want you to see the alabaster. I want you to see the fainting couches and the linen on the walls, and see Queen Vashti. What color were her eyes? Did she have long eyelashes? What color was her hair? Was her hair long? Was it braided? Did she wear it down? Did she have beautiful hands? What color was her skin? How did she dress? I mean, imagine all of that. Now, what happens is these eunuchs come up and tell Queen Vashti to come down, wearing her crown. Now, some history states that King Ahasuerus, you got to remember, he's drunk. He wants her to come down wearing just her crown. In other words, naked. I don't know if that's true, but that is what a lot of history states, is that he wanted her to come down wearing her crown and the rest of her body unveiled. But in verse 12 it says, "But Queen Vashti refused to come to the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him." So, if the king had not been drinking, do you think he would have asked for such a thing as his wife to come down? I mean, after all, the people in his area knew what Queen Vashti looked like. Even if she came down fully dressed, he didn't have to show her off. And it was uncommon for people to ogle the queen and just look at her. So the whole thing was just, out of sorts. But he was drunk, and he was showing off his whole place, and, he decided he'd show her off too. And these men had seen Vashti before. They knew what she looked like, unless indeed she was to show them her naked body. Her appearance would have caused lewd behavior probably among these drunken men. You have to imagine, King Ahasuerus could have, if this in fact was true, things could have really gotten out of hand once she went down there in that, without clothes on. So she says she's not going to do it. Now, back in the day when the queen refuses the king, or any woman refused a man, can you imagine what normally happened to them? They were usually done away with, killed. So in verses 13 and 14 it says, "Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times," the wise men, they're kind of like lawyers, and so he says to them, they're closest to him. He lists all of them. There's 7 princesses who had ranked very high in his kingdom, and he says, "What shall we do with Queen Vashti according to the law? Because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by her eunuchs." And one of them answered and said, "Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes, all the people who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all the women, and they will despise their husbands." These men, these wise men, these attorneys are talking to King Ahasuerus, and they're afraid that their wife is going to act like her and disobey them. So they've got to come up with some kind of solution, because she has just been a bad girl. So King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti to be brought in before him, and she did not come. And they are so upset about this. So it goes on to say, "This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king," they have this great idea, "let a royal decree go from him. Now, a decree is a letter, and a decree is a letter that cannot be revoked. And the decree has to be sealed with the king's ring or his signet of some kind. It's almost like if it's a ring, and let's just say it has his initial on it, he dips it in wax and he seals the letter up. And the letter has to go out. It cannot be revoked. And so they're coming up with this idea that, they've got to do something because she's going to make all these women disobey their husbands. So they come up with this idea that to write this decree and let it be recorded in the law so that it can't be altered, that Vashti shall become no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another one who is better than she is. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, all the wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king, and so he said, yeah, let's do that. Let's send that out. We're going to find me a better queen than she is, and we're just going to do away with her, and we're going to make sure all the women obey their husbands and not act like my Queen Vashti acted. So he sent the letters to the king's provinces, to each one in his own script, meaning whatever language they had. Again, mine would have to be Southern, but whatever language the people spoke is the language that they got their decree in, and to every people their own language, that each man should be master of his own house and speak in the language of his own people. So, I guess King Ahasuerus showed Queen Vashti who was boss. Or so he thinks he did. He thinks he got away with it. So, I'll continue with chapter 2 in the next video. Hope you guys are enjoying. It's always wonderful to learn more about God's Word.